My bad.
All right, we're on. We start over again? We'll
just go.
Okay. This is History 3379, World Civilizations to 1500. Don, how do I get my slides on the screen? Okay, that's the one we want, World Civilizations to 1500. And tonight we're going to have an introductory lecture, and the title of this lecture is What is History and What is Truth? Okay, I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm Sally Vaughn, and I'm a medievalist. I teach medieval history, and I largely specialize in England and France, Italy and Sicily, but also church history. I actually work on St. Anselm of Canterbury and the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, the English church, and the Vikings. I teach courses in all those fields. I have a second field in Rome, the Republican Empire, which I don't teach anymore, but it's background for this class, so I have preparation in the Roman Empire and Greece and Rome. I've also lived in Malaysia for a year, where I taught and traveled all over Southeast Asia and East Asia. So I've been to a number of different places in the world that we're going to cover in this course. So tonight we're going to talk about the introduction, what is history and what is truth, and we're going to discuss some of the theories of history and why study history and what we can learn about history and from history, and some of the rules that I'm using to govern how I'm discussing history in this course. Here is an article that appeared in the New York Times last Sunday, and let me read a little bit about it to you. We in the West find it incomprehensible that theological ideas still inflame the minds of men, stirring up messianic passions that can leave societies in ruin. We had assumed that this was no longer possible, that human beings had learned to separate religious questions from political ones, that political theology died in 16th century Europe. We were wrong. It is we who are the fragile exception. And I'm quoting Mike Lilla in the New York Times Magazine, Sunday, August 19th, 2007. The article that I'm quoting is called The Politics of God. And here's an example from that article. In May of last year, President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran sent an open letter to President George W. Bush that was translated and published in newspapers around the world. Its theme was contemporary politics, and its language that of divine revelation. After rehearsing a litany of grievances against American foreign policies, real and imagined, Ahmadinejad wrote, "If Prophet Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Ishmael, Joseph, or Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, were with us today, how would they have judged such behavior?" This was not a rhetorical question. I have been told that Your Excellency follows the teachings of Jesus, peace be upon him, and believes in the divine promise of the rule of the righteous on earth. Ahmadinejad continued, reminding his fellow believer that, according to divine verses, we have all been called upon to worship one God and follow the teaching of divine prophets. There follows a kind of altar call in which the American president is invited to bring his actions into line with these verses, and then comes a threatening prophecy. Quote, liberalism and Western-style democracy have not been able to help realize the ideals of humanity. Today, these two concepts have failed. Those with insight can already hear the sounds of the shattering and fall of the ideology and thoughts of the liberal democratic systems. Whether we like it or not, the world is gravitating towards faith in the Almighty, and justice and the will of God will prevail over all things. Okay, this is the language of political theology, Mark Lilla continues, and for millennia it was the only tongue human beings had for expressing their thoughts about political life. So the Islamic point of view is the traditional one that is common to all cultures of the world except the West. The West is different. And so Mark Lilla continues, The problem is ours, not his. A little more than 2 centuries ago, we began to believe that the West was on a one-way track toward modern secular democracy, and that other societies, once placed on that track, would inevitably follow. Though this has not happened, we still maintain our implicit faith in a modernizing process and blame delays on extenuating circumstances like poverty or colonialism. Okay, I won't continue. I urge you to go online and read this article, which will be online at the New York Times. But this is one problem that we face in world civilizations, the differences between cultures and the differences between points of view. We all face the same questions of political existence, yet their way of answering them has become alien to us, meaning the ways of other people. On one shore, political institutions are conceived in terms of divine authority and spiritual redemption. On the other, they are not. And that, as Robert Frost might have put it, makes all the difference. And so one of the things we want to do is try to bridge that gap and study these kinds of things. Is democracy the answer? Well, maybe democracy is not the cure of everything. Remember, Hitler and Mussolini were elected democratically, and Nazism and communism were modern expressions of political ideologies, godless but justified by political theology. And so we have this way of understanding the reality of the world through modern democracy, conceiving of democracy as a way to control the forces that we can't control, or religion. Religion is another answer that has been posed. And again, I'm continuing with the Mark Lilla article. Imagine human beings who first become aware of themselves in a world not of their own making. Their world has unknown origins and behaves in a regular fashion, so they wonder why that is. They know that the things they themselves fashion behave in a predictable manner because they conceive and construct them with some end in mind. They stretch the bow, the arrow flies. So by analogy, it is not difficult for them to assume that the cosmic order was constructed for a purpose, reflecting its maker's will. They begin to have ideas about that maker, about his intentions and his personality. So this is Mark Lilla's theory about the way religions get started and what religions actually are. Okay, now let's go to another article that I have. Let's see if I've got it. Yes, this is another article that appeared in the New York Times in 2001. And this is by Alexander Still. He begins with the question, why has Poland prospered and Russia struggled since the end of the Cold War? Why is the economy of South Korea 15 times as large as that of Ghana when they were comparable less than 40 years ago? Why have the Chinese minorities thrived economically in such different places as Malaysia, the Philippines, and San Francisco? The answer in all these cases is culture, according to a growing number of scholars who have come to believe that social attitudes are more important than politics and economics in determining why some societies are richer than others. If we learn anything from the history of economic development, it is that culture makes almost all the difference, declares David Landis, a professor of history at Harvard, in Culture Matters: How Values Shape Human Progress. Okay. And this is David Landis. In Basic Books, a new collection of essays that is a kind of manifesto for this increasingly influential school of thought. Okay. Here is the name of that book and the editors of the book. It's a collection of articles. This book challenges the assumptions of market economists and liberal and Marxist thinkers. Culture Matters essentially creates a map of world culture, comparing various cultural values like interpersonal trust, tolerance, attitudes toward authority, and personal freedom. Okay? And so this is another theory about how things work and why cultures operate the way they do. These are some of the things that we're going to examine in this class. We're going to look at a number of different cultures of the world, and we're going to see if we can figure out why those cultures tick, how they operate, what are the clusters of beliefs and practices within each culture that make each culture work. But we've got a dilemma with these two articles I've quoted. Which one of these theories is the most persuasive? What is more important? Is religion more important? Is economics more important? Is culture and cultural values more important? What is the most important element? And this brings us to the question of what is truth? Which of these theories is the most persuasive? Which is the one is the truth? Why do human beings behave the way they do? And why do cultures function the way they do? And how can we find the answers to these questions? Well, I want to examine some of the ways that we can approach these questions and try to come to some answers about the various cultures of the world. There is, in fact, a crisis of truth in the modern world. Many of you will remember when Bill Clinton was president and he was being interviewed about the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and he was asked a question, and his answer was, it all depends on what the meaning of the word is. And so this is the way people spin the truth, by definitions, by parsing sentences, by cutting fine lines. There is a crisis of truth in the modern world. There, in fact, are many truths in the modern world, and you've heard that said often in various kinds of ways, that there are points of view, that certain people have a particular point of view that's not shared by everyone, and someone else can have an opposite point of view. Can you think of any examples of that sort of thing? Anybody, just off the top of your head? Could you press your microphone?
Republicans and Democrats, they have separate ideas.
Yes, Republicans and Democrats, yes, they have very different ideas. Can you think of a more precise, give an example of, and press your microphone, give an example of something.
The view on abortion.
Okay, the view on abortion. And there's one truth about abortion from the Republicans who believe it's a sin or a crime, and Democrats tend to take a view that it's a right of women to have abortion. That it's a completely different point of view, as if they live in different worlds. Can anybody else think of another example? Press your mic. Okay.
Does it also coincide with the religious right, or their doctrine on how Christians or other religions are supposed to act?
Okay, I think you're saying the religious right is more guided by religious ideas, being guided by God and Christianity in many cases, whereas what would you say the Democrats are guided by in opposition to that, or as a different parallel point of view? Somebody else can answer if they want to. But remember to press your mic. Yes.
Democrats are view more about the social implications in society, the good of the society, versus being strictly religious.
Okay. The social implications.
Humanistic.
Okay. A more humanistic idea as opposed to a religious idea that God is making the rules, whereas some Republicans would say that God is making the rules. Can you think of any other examples of where there are very, very evident differing points of views? Yeah.
Like Hindus and Muslims have extremely different points of views.
Okay, Muslims and who? What was the other one you said?
Hindus and Muslims, their views of truth, or let's say like you could lump like the Judeo-Christian, Islamic faiths when compared to like Hinduism or Buddhism. Yeah.
Okay, so that you have very different views of particular situations. I was thinking of one example that might, hit all of you. in a place where you would really see this. What about the view of the Europeans who discovered the New World and colonized it? Okay, their point of view is they discovered a new land that was empty, and they're sending people to colonize it and exploit it. Okay, what would be the opposing point of view from a very different worldview? Anybody think of?
It can come from.
Press your mic.
From an anthropological point of view, it can be said that there were settlers before anyone, came and conquered, that there were tribes and people that had already, inhabited that land, and therefore, someone coming from outside, they're not really the first settlers, but, they're outsiders coming in.
Okay, exactly. The American Indian point of view, the Native American point of view would be that these Europeans are invaders. Okay, that they're invading their land. And so this is an utterly different, opposed point of view by two different groups of people looking at the same events. Okay. So when you look at this kind of thing and you can say, well, from the American Indian point of view, this is a valid point of view. I mean, the colonists were invaders who came into their land that was not empty, but it was a land they lived in and exploited and settled themselves. Whereas the Europeans, from their point of view in the world they were familiar with, the land was empty and it was there to be exploited. Okay, so you've got two utterly different points of view about the same event. So what is the truth? What is the truth? What are you going to do about a situation like that? How are you going to know what's true?
I think the truth depends on what society wants to really see. I mean, because there can be no eternal or absolute truth about any situation, especially when two situations are brought in together. There's always going to be 2 points of views, and I suppose those points of views, can be construed as two different truths.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you have two different truths, then maybe you have three different truths. Can you think of another truth about the same situation? You think of another European point of view that comes later in the colonial period, where the Europeans think of themselves as having the white man's burden, and they're coming to teach the backward people. This is a point of view that, again, is held by the Europeans that comes from their perspective. So there is yet another third point of view, a third truth, if you want to call it that. So what do you do in a situation like this? Does this mean there's no truth at all? If there are multiple truths and they contradict each other, what are we going to do about that? Yeah.
You could argue that truth is relative.
Well, if everything's relative, there's no truth at all.
Okay, then.
So, if you have a situation where either you cannot know the truth or there is no truth, how are you going to study history? Yeah.
You study whoever wins, because the loser's story never really comes across. It's not traded and passed down in history.
Okay, so it's winner take all. It's the strongest is the truth belongs to the strongest. The truth belongs to the victor. We've got an opposing point of view over here.
No, actually, I think a lot of the times both sides have a lot of truth, but just because they're losers does not mean they're incorrect. A lot of their sources can actually bring a lot of light to a situation where there's gaps in history. And both may be right, but each perspective is skewed, or each perspective is geared towards their viewpoint.
Geared toward their viewpoint, yes. Okay, but if that's true, if you have two or more perspectives on everything, and there are two versions of the truth, how are we as students of history going to know what the truth is? How are we going to know? Don't forget to press your mic. Okay.
You look for the actual facts and then filter through the opinions.
Okay, that's very interesting. We've defined two different categories of information, opinions and facts. Okay, so that that's a little bit skewing it. There are facts and there are facts. There are facts that are theories that are on the verge of being opinions. They're theories about, for example, colonialism is wrong. That's a theory that the Europeans were colonialists and they exploited native peoples, and that this is a wrong thing. This is a theory. This is more of a theory or opinion than a fact. What actually is a fact? What can you say is a fact? This is coming to the very end of my lecture, but how do we define what a fact is?
I think in historical, from a historical point of view, a fact is something that's, should be, separated from a point of view, although it should, it should take birth from that, and it has, a sort of a marriage with points of views and opinions, and rather than saying that this X person went to Jamestown and met these Indians, and he got a disease, we would say that this person went to this place, and whatever his cultural reference was, we should take that out and see the basis point of what happened, and that should be a fact.
Okay, can anybody, yes, I think you're on the right track there. Can anybody give a concrete example of what she was telling us about what a fact is? What is a fact? Anybody give a concrete example of that? Yeah.
Things that we find written, recorded records of events that have happened, actual original texts from people that were there, using archaeological finds to determine what happened, those types of facts.
Okay, those can be facts, yes. But can you give a concrete example of what that could be? For example, if you say Columbus discovered America in 1492, that's not exactly a fact. He discovered America from the European perspective, but he sailed from America and landed in the New World in Hispaniola, in the island of Hispaniola. That's a fact. Okay, we know he sailed and he landed in the New World. So that's a fact that we can depend on. And that is not skewed by figuring out what is, okay? Whereas Columbus discovers America is a European perspective of what he was doing, okay? So that's a kind of fact. I had some other examples of facts that I was going to mention. I'll come to them later, but let me go along, and we'll come back to this situation in a moment. There's a crisis of history in the modern world, and it comes from this crisis of truth, that there are many different versions of truth. So let's kind of get on the subject of history for a moment. What is history? How do we define history? Can anybody give a definition of history?
It's an accumulation of all the experiences of the past people that, they've gone throughout the centuries, or, even a few hundred years. Okay,
so history is a record of the past. Did you have something to add to that? No? Okay. History is a record of the past. And is it everything that happened in the past, is it just human events, or does it include natural events of other kinds as well? Yeah.
History is a record of everything that's ever happened. It's not just humans or just Earth. It's how they interact, and just the history of both, like the story of how everything happened.
Okay, so history can be everything that happened. In what ways is history useful and important? Can anybody think of any ways that history is useful and important?
I think, it's, if we know our history, we're better, we have a better chance of modernizing ourselves, because when we, invent or discover, a certain aspect of our lives, we are in turn modernizing ourselves and learning from the past. And that's how, history can, I guess, better us.
History can better us because we learn from it and we educate ourselves about it. Any other ideas about why history is important or useful? Yes.
It keeps us as a human people from making the same mistake that could have previously been made throughout the world.
Okay, hopefully we learn from the past not to make the same mistake over again, although I'm not that optimistic about human endeavors in human history. It seems to me we often see people making the same mistakes over and over again, but ideally we should learn from the past and learn from mistakes. Any other ways you can think of that history is useful or important? Yeah.
For collecting data, like geologic data or human history data.
For collecting data, and so that we would learn from the data, and so just a lot of facts to increase our knowledge. Did you have an idea?
It's useful for understanding different cultures, particularly perhaps grievances that they may have with each other. Especially as Americans, we don't necessarily understand a lot of the stuff that goes on in the Middle East, but there's a huge historical background to that. So understanding the history to it can help us understand the modern day grievances that people have with each other.
So understanding history can help us understand other people who are not part of our culture, people in different cultures. It can help one culture understand another culture by learning about those people. Okay, that's one thing. Is there any way that history can help you personally as an individual? Have you ever thought about whether history is useful to you as an individual, as just a modern person in modern America? Can you think of any way that it would be helpful or useful to you? Yeah.
I guess it would help for law school or politics, where you tell different truths, different types of ways. So,
it would help you tell different truths. Yes.
Yeah, that's the benefit of law.
It would be helpful for lawyers, like Bill Clinton, to define is one way or another. Yes, that is true, that people could use history in that way. Yeah, there's another idea back there, yeah.
Well, going back to what was previously said about understanding cultures in general, it can help us socially understand each individual person better, to realize what they believe and where they come from, as opposed to being ignorant of people.
Yes, in America today, in a very diverse, multicultural society, it will help us to understand our friends that we have if they come from a different culture, or even if they're Americans who come from whose family comes from a culture outside America. They have different customs that they keep, and so it helps us to understand them. What about if you're a businessman and you do international business and you travel to Japan or China or Africa or any part of the world? Don't you think history would be very useful to you to understand the cultures of the places that you're going to? What about understanding yourself and understanding your own culture? If you can understand how your culture developed and what are the customs of your own culture and what are the forces that shaped your own culture, you can then understand yourself better and why you think the things you do and do the things you do, because many of these things are culturally determined. The training you have from childhood within your family that comes from a particular culture, and this helps shape you as an individual. So studying history can help you understand yourself as well as other cultures and other people, and in business and in your career and people you deal with. Any other thoughts that you might have on how history is useful or valuable?
I think today, especially in the American culture, genealogy and, the the use of genealogy, like our ancestors or like, our grandparents and, great-great-grandparents, they came here from, Ireland, and that's supposedly, I presume that's a sort of history when we learn about where they came from and, what culture we really belong to.
Mm-hmm. So that studying your family, your own family history, you could know more about your family and the roots that your family came from, and then studying the broader history of that culture, you can understand more where your grandparents came from and how you developed as a person through that. Well, what can you do if you know history that you can't do it if you don't? It's kind of a hard question. Yeah.
I believe you can actually predict the future to some degree. For example, the U.S. right now seems to be following the pattern of Britain in the past, and it's going to self-destruct eventually.
So that you can predict the future in a way. Well, this is a variation of, do we learn from the past? If we see the mistakes of the past, can we correct them in time to keep us from following that same path? Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question. There are actually people called futurists who study history in order to determine what the paths of the future are going to be. So there are people who do that, who make careers of that kind of study. There's a problem with that in that history never repeats itself exactly. Okay, it can repeat maybe small things or incidental things, but the whole pattern never repeats the past exactly. And so you always have to be on the lookout for new elements in order to predict the future. So it's not quite that easy and to do. But it's a possibility that some people think that they would like to try and they would like to make that work. We also might mention cultural genealogies. Okay, we speak of genealogies within our own family. That we have genealogies. Our grandparents and our great-grandparents came from another country and came and settled in America in most of our cases. And so we have a family genealogy. Cultures also have a genealogy. What genealogy would the United States belong to? A cultural genealogy. If you think of a cultural family that develops and has descendants, what would you say the United States is a descendant of?
The Europeans.
Partly the Europeans. Certainly the beginning of the American colonies, the 13 colonies, were European in origin, and particularly English, although there were French colonies. There were also Spanish colonies, but European culture, and certainly our government in the United States is largely predicated on British principles and British political organizing principles of the government. It goes back farther than that, though. Does anybody know the genealogy of our government as one example? There's another ancestor besides British Parliament for our government.
The Romans?
The Romans, yes. Our founding fathers studied the government of Rome very carefully, and it's modeled as much on the government of Rome as it is modeled on the government of Britain. And so that's an example of a cultural genealogy that things are passed down through not only generations but centuries, where customs are passed on. Okay, well, there's one element of how the past is used in the modern world that we haven't touched on yet, and that is as a mythology. That the past can be used in the modern world to create a mythical past for that culture and to persuade people to believe in that mythical past, and in that way history can be used almost as propaganda, and in fact very much like propaganda. To create a mythical past, to encourage patriotism, for example, within the country. Can you think of any examples of that sort of thing, of countries that create a mythology for themselves to influence their people? Cultures that create mythology for themselves.
Was the French Revolution based on that rhetoric by any chance?
The French Revolution, I think the French Revolution created a mythology for France that France still follows to this day. Do you have an example of that?
Well, even in movies during the 80s, during the whole Cold War thing, like one of the prime examples was Rocky IV, when Rocky the American fought Drago the Russian, and in the end Rocky ended up winning.
Yes, exactly. That kind of mythology that countries create for themselves. They create their own heroes that exemplify what they want their people to believe in their culture. And this has happened since the dawn of time. Every culture we're going to look at in this course is going to have that kind of a mythology that they create to identify their culture and the specific things that belong to that culture. And we have that in America too. You gave the example of the Cold War and the Soviets and the Americans. Can anybody think of any other? It's hard to think of mythologies in our own culture because they're so familiar to us. Yeah.
I think about the Industrial Revolution in England and in America. It's kind of remembered as the golden age of all these advances, but although there were all those advances, there was a lot of human suffering that was unprecedented. The poverty, the conditions that people were living in, both in America and in England, were horrible. But when I think about the Industrial Revolution, I think about, wow, everybody thinks about all the modern technologies that were advanced.
Okay, the Industrial Revolution is thought of as a golden age, as something that brings great benefit to mankind through industrialization, but there's the other side of that coin that brings great human misery as well. But if you only publicize the benefits and ignore the bad side, then it comes across as propaganda. And we have this, well, I won't go into that, but every culture creates a mythology for itself, ideals for that culture to live in. Can you think of any things you were taught, like in third grade? What about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree? And when he was asked, did you chop down that cherry tree? And he said, oh yes, I did it with my little axe. And so he was standing up for the truth. He always told the truth. And so this is a story you're told as children, so you will always tell the truth. And George Washington is a child hero of this story. And it's a myth. Okay, it's a mythology that we're all taught. Okay, so we've talked about some of the ways that we can look at the past. How do we find out about what happened in the past? Well, to find out what happened in the past, we have to look for evidence. We have to look for evidence, which can be facts of various kinds. Hopefully it's facts, but even opinions can be evidence, because the fact that people had such an opinion is a fact in itself. Okay. So facts are something that we can prove that are hard and fast and true, and that we can use as evidence. Okay, and we have to separate that from theories and opinions. We take all our facts and we have to analyze them. Okay, putting them all together and put them through through a process of analysis, and out of that analysis comes an interpretation. Okay, and this is where you get into trouble, when you start interpreting those facts, and that's when you come up with multiple truths. Again, the idea of the colonization of America. Columbus either discovered America, or he landed in America, and he brought diseases and exploited America, and so then we start getting into analysis of the facts, interpretation. Under interpretation, we have a problem of both bias and plagiarism. And I mentioned plagiarism because I have an article here by a historian who, here it is. This is a historian who is a prolific biographer. James McKay's biography of John Paul Jones is under attack because he plagiarized the whole thing. Okay, this is not good. Plagiarism is copying someone else's work, and for a prominent historian to be accused of that is a very bad thing. Plagiarism is something we want to avoid at all costs. That's the worst case scenario, is the plagiarism. Bias is something that can be both conscious and unconscious, and here is where our points of view come into being. Okay, if you write from a Republican point of view, you're going to write with one particular kind of bias. If you're going to write from a Democratic point of view, you write with another kind of bias. Historians try not to have any biases. They try very hard, especially conscientious, honest historians try to write without biases, but it's almost impossible to do because people have unconscious biases that they don't recognize. So again, it's a minefield, writing history, reading history, studying history, because you're always going to run into biases. Another way that historians work and find out what happened in the past is to have a model. And this is to say, for example, the Industrial Revolution is a model for how countries industrialize. And this is often characterized as economic takeoff. And so we have this model of how countries industrialize, like Britain industrialized, and all the developing countries of the world want to follow that model. Okay, you have that model and you try to copy it. Historians will sometimes look at a model like that and say, here is this model of industrialization. We saw it happen in Britain. Then we see it happen again in America. America follows that model of industrialization that began in Britain. The problem with models is they're never exact. You can use a model very loosely and say industrialization took place in Britain. It takes place in America, but it's different. Even if it follows loosely the same model, it's going to have different consequences and different developments. And the same is going to happen, for example, in Korea when they industrialized and they followed a slightly different model because their culture is different. So models can be dangerous. You have to keep aware that they're only very loose and that they can vary from place to place. History is often thought of as a list of names and dates, okay? Some of you in high school and earlier years, you took your history classes and the coach taught them and you were told to memorize 20,000 names and 50,000 dates, right? We don't do that in this class. Names and dates are important because they're facts, but only if they have meaning. It's absolutely useless to memorize a list of dates or a list of names. Only if you connect them with meaningful events and developments do they have any uses. And so we want to keep our use of names and dates to a minimum. Only the most important ones do you want to single out and remember. History is elusive. It changes from generation to generation. 100 years ago, historians wrote about war and politics and law. They wrote about the administration and the government of a country, and they wrote about elites. You don't find that kind of history very much in the modern world, in 21st century America and Europe. You find people writing about social events, social classes. They write about economics. They write about families and women, minorities and the masses, children, rural life rather than city life. 100 years from now, they're going to be writing about something different. So this is one way that history is elusive. People in different generations are interested in different things, and they write about different things. And so you never get the full picture from any of the history books you're reading, including the textbooks we're reading for this class. You're getting the focus on what interests that generation at that time. Now, if you want to know about war and politics and government, well, you can go to the library and get 19th century books, and you will find a lot about war and politics and government, especially about the far past. But modern people are not writing about that. I'm seeing the trend in genetics. People are writing a lot about genetics, and we're learning a lot more about history from genetics, particularly migrations and movements of people. Each generation reevaluates the past in terms of its present. Each generation thinks different things are important, and so they rewrite history all the time. This is kind of why history is difficult to study because there's a different environment, different interests and values and concepts that people have. There are facts and facts. Certain specific events, people, and actions are true in that they happened. Others are not. An example of a true fact is that Julius Caesar was murdered in 44 BC. Okay, and we know who his murderers were. We know exactly who they were and how they did it. So that's a fact. But what about, take the case of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire? That's not a fact. That's a concept. People used to argue about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire 100 years ago, but now they say, well, wait a minute. Decline is a value judgment. Rome, being neither up nor down, cannot fall. Okay, so that Rome did not decline and it didn't fall. What it did was morph into something different, into the Middle Ages. Okay, so that is not a fact, that the Roman Empire declined and fell. It's an opinion. How we interpret the meanings or effects of events changes. History is a continuous debate and a dialogue. Just as we were saying, there are many truths. History is a dialogue between all the many truths, and hopefully in this dialogue we'll come to some consensus of what actually is true. Historians disagree with each other, and some of them quite violently disagree. In England in the 19th century, there were two historians, and I'm forgetting one of their names, but they were Whigs and Tories, and they had violent arguments about whether England was more Norman or more Anglo-Saxon, because of course William the Conqueror was a Norman who conquered England in 1066, and so there's one school of thought in England that says everything English is Norman in origin. The Normans brought everything and created England, and there's another school of thought that says the Normans were invaders, they were foreigners, and that everything truly English was Anglo-Saxon and existed before the Normans came. This debate was going on violently in the 19th century. It's still going on today. This is the history I work in, and that argument is still going on, whether the Normans or the Anglo-Saxons created England. There are numerous different interpretations and models of the same set of events. And note that events do come in sets. You can't isolate a fact and just take it out of context and say, here is this fact, which I just did. I said Julius Caesar was murdered in 44 BC. There's a set of facts that goes with that, and the set of facts is that Julius Caesar was taking over the Roman government, and people were afraid that he was going to be a dictator and that he was going to make himself king and destroy the Roman Republic, which was democratic in form, okay? So you can't take a fact out of isolation. You've got to put it within a context of circumstances. Nothing exists in isolation. History is an approximation of the past. We can't know exactly what happened in the past. We try to approximate what happens, and at the same time, the past remains the same, but our views of it do not. It's our views that change about the past as we look at it from different perspectives, okay? I guarantee you that 100 years ago, nobody was saying that the Europeans exploited and ruined America and stole it from the Indians. Nobody said that 100 years ago. This is a modern idea, a new way of looking at the same set of facts and interpreting it in a different way. New discoveries can utterly transform our views of the past. Examples are genetics and linguistics, and these are very cutting-edge disciplines that people are studying. I'm going to give you a lot on genetics in the second half of tonight's lecture, because so many new discoveries are being made in genetics, and so this is a wave of the future. Yet truth does exist, and it exists in historical sources. Okay. Where do we find the facts? Well, here's an example of the truth. Anybody know who this is? I've got the name there, Cleopatra. Okay, this is Cleopatra, and here's an article in the New York Times. Cleopatra Career Woman. A new exhibition portrays a queen today's feminists can be proud of. Okay, so here is Cleopatra. When you think of Cleopatra, what do you think of? Elizabeth Taylor sailing down the Nile in a golden barge? Okay. The queen of corruption. Okay, the Romans called Cleopatra the harlot queen. They saw her as the seducer of Mark Antony. The Romans blackened Cleopatra's reputation forever. Modern historians are now interpreting her as an able administrator, an effective queen, very well loved, a talented linguist, and a well-educated intellectual. She was definitely not black. There's a school of African-American historians who claim that Cleopatra was black, and the comment in the Times is, the hypothesis that her unidentified paternal grandmother was black is sheer wishful thinking. Okay, this has been pretty much proved. She's Greek. She's not black. She's Greek. And so here is an example of the kind of debate that's going on and the way that truth changes over time. Okay, the reinterpretation of Cleopatra. Studies in genetics look at where do we come from, to whom we are we related? If genes determine everything about us, do we have any free will? And this is quite interesting, that the debate over whether people have free will or not, that old theological debate that Christians used to argue about interminably, now it's re-emerged because genetics are being shown to have so much power over individual human beings that philosophers are again thinking, do we have any free will? And this is the new study of the brain that's also raising these theories. Well, where do we find the facts and what kind of evidence can we use? We can use written words of all kinds. Yes, comment.
I had a question. What would be an example of how genetics determines someone's free will?
Of how genetics determines someone's free will. Okay. Yes, you have an idea. I'm taken by surprise here. Yeah.
There's a book by Steven Pinker. It's called Human Nature versus Human Nurture, and it talks about linguistics and also about how genes, we have predispositions to certain genes, and they tell us to, the way that we act. It's not all related to culture, but, we have innate abilities that we otherwise, wouldn't do.
I think that's a good explanation, and a more specific example would be, I'm thinking of one of my sons here, who tends to be reckless and daring, and I think this is genetic. That's the way he is, and he tends to take chances, and he tends to take enormous risks, and that we have these tendencies that are genetically linked to what we're doing. Tendencies to be a quiet person, a contemplative person, or an active person, a sportsman. Yeah.
So I guess it'd be kind of like, no matter how hard you try, you're going to turn into your mom or your dad.
Could you speak a little louder?
So no matter how hard you try, you're going to turn into your mom or dad?
Yes, some people have that theory. No matter how hard you try, you're going to turn into your mom or dad. Yeah, that is genetically linked. Certain diseases, we know that diseases are genetically linked. Let me mention to you another example that I'm going to mention in the lecture when we get to it. But what about lactose tolerance or intolerance? There are certain cultures developed lactose tolerance because they herd animals, and the using of the milk and cheese and milk products of those animals give them a survival advantage. And so we have people who are lactose tolerant. The two main groups of those are Europeans are lactose tolerant, and there's a tribe of African Bushmen who were cattle herders who developed lactose tolerance as well. It's connected with the herding of animals, and it's genetic. So if you like cheese and you can digest it, that's genetic. That choice you make, whether to eat it or not to eat it, is linked to your genes. including ice cream and things like that. Anybody else think of an example of genetic programming?
Well, adopted children, and I speak from personal experience. I didn't find my birth parents until I was in my 30s, and I am a carbon copy. My birth mother was a psychologist. I'm studying psychology. She read voraciously. Nobody in my family reads but me. Just different things that I like to do, she did, and no one could understand, well, she's kind of weird, she's our little study girl and she goes to school. And nobody in my family that raised me is like that. So it definitely is a genetic thing that I thought that those things, were there.
Yes, and more studies are showing that, and they're learning about the brain and the areas of the brain, for example, that control emotion and language and speaking skills, and it's a matter of how well your brain is developed, and it's kind of scary. More and more of those studies are showing that physical attributes and genetics have a lot of control over what we do. So that it erodes your faith in free will. But still, human beings make decisions, and so if they're conscious of those things, people still can have free will. But there's a debate going on about it, about whether they have free will. Well, where do we find the facts, and what kind of evidence can we use? And again, I was mentioning written words, literature, documents, letters, records, diaries, biographies, memoirs, all kinds of written records, and that is the traditional way that people used to write history. It used to be that people only used written records, and that's all they looked at. Nowadays, historians use a lot of different things. They use coins and medals, because a coin, for example, can have inscriptions. It can be a propaganda artifact that propagandizes the ruler or the king or the emperor who is on that coin. Archaeological artifacts of all kinds, buildings, art and architecture, those are historical facts that we can look at. Statistics, court records, baptismal records, law codes, trade and merchant records, geography. Religions are very important. Technologies and environmental studies. History is a whole amalgam of details, the microcosm, the smallest elements, and the largest elements in the macrocosm, which is the entire environment. And so history is everything, everything. You have to look at everything. The historian is a detective who looks at primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Can you think of examples of each one of these things? What is a primary source?
Something original.
Go ahead.
An original work, or an original piece of historical record.
Okay, it's not just an original work, but it's a work written at that time by those people. For example, a Greek epic, Homer, the epics of Homer, that is a primary source for the Greeks, because the Greeks wrote it at the time of their earliest history. That's a primary source. Okay, what is a secondary source?
Something written later in the times, some interpretation of the original work.
Good, exactly. A secondary source is something like, well, if we took as an example of primary sources the writings of the Greeks, Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of the things the Greeks wrote, Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, those are primary sources. A secondary source is a modern textbook written about the Greeks. Okay, somebody who writes a textbook about the Greeks, or a book about, not a textbook, but a book about the Greeks, written by a modern person, using the primary sources, but explaining them. That's a secondary source. What is a tertiary source? I've given you a clue. A tertiary source is a textbook, like your textbook for this course, that takes a bunch of secondary sources and reinterprets the secondary sources. So it's really removed from the primary sources. Which one do you think is the closest to the truth? The primary sources. The primary sources are closest to the truth because they are the truth. They're things written by those people at that time. We know maybe what they say is not true, but we know that the fact that they're written by those people said those things and believe those things, and that is true. And that is the closest you can actually get to the truth. Okay. History, in fact, is everything. Choosing facts and finding facts and putting them all together. The historian is like a detective who is putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle that includes both primary sources and secondary sources, usually not textbooks or tertiary. So those are the most unreliable things, the textbooks and tertiary sources. Here are some examples of written work. These are Egyptian hieroglyphics. This is Mayan hieroglyphics. The Mayans wrote and left a written record. Oops, sorry, that's a Greek. That's the earliest Greek book. And so the Greeks wrote, of course. This is a medieval manuscript, again, something written. And there's also a list there. It's a list of ministers so it's a source of a different kind. Okay, this is a Mongol manuscript with written sources of the Mongols. Here's a coin, a gold medal of Theodosius, who is one of the Roman emperors, glorifying him and propagandizing him. Pottery, any artifacts, archaeological artifacts that you might find. These are primary sources. This is a Roman triumphal arch, the Arch of Constantine, and we can learn about people by the kinds of buildings that they built, and buildings are characteristic of each culture. This is a Roman triumphal arch. The Romans were good at war. They glorified war, and this is a celebration of war, and all the pictures on that arch are Constantine's victories. Okay, this is an Islamic building. Excuse me, the Alhambra in Spain. And so we can see in here an amalgamation of Islamic culture, which is a blend of many different cultures. Very graceful and beautiful. Here's an Indian temple on the Benares. So we can characterize each culture by the art and architecture it produces. Here's an interesting chart. It shows on the right, you can see the pyramids, how high they are. On the left is a medieval cathedral. If you can see that cathedral to the left of the pyramid, the medieval cathedrals were the first buildings that reached the heights of the pyramids. And to the right of that pyramid is a Renaissance building that isn't quite as high as the cathedral, and nothing surpassed the size of the cathedrals until the modern times where you see skyscrapers. It's an interesting little historical fact. Art of all kinds. This is public art, propaganda. This is the Emperor Augustus, and it's a piece of propaganda glorifying Augustus. This is another Roman emperor. This piece of art is Diocletian, and it's showing the Roman tendency toward portraiture and realism, which is a very important part of Roman culture. This is yet another Roman emperor, Justinian, a Byzantine emperor who is, you can see the culture has changed drastically because they're not showing those realistic portraits anymore. But now the emperor as the head of a court in a much more formal way has become important. So a change has happened that we can see through the art. Okay, maps. We use a lot of maps because we can see the growth of empires, as we can see here the Roman Empire. We can see geography, we can see environment, and all of those things are important to understanding history. This is South America. This is the area that this is a map actually that shows where Columbus landed. And here is the Mongol Empire in two different phases. The orange is the early phase, and then it expanded into the yellow areas there. So we can see the growth of empires. Here's the Great Wall of China, more architecture that we can see as an important element of that culture. And a very different environment in the South Sea Islands, where we can see the spread of that kind of culture, okay? And religion, of course, is extremely important. In every culture has a religion. Every culture, even cultures that don't have religions, they have ideologies that substitute for religions. But in fact, there's some study about genetics now. There's been a study just recently that has claimed to discover the religion gene, and the scientists are claiming that all human beings have a gene that makes them believe in religions. Again, something that's genetic, that is supposed to be genetically programmed. Well, this is Krishna, who is a Hindu god. Here's a Chinese god. And so these are all of the different aspects that we're going to study. We have 3 books that we're going to use in this class. We have a textbook, which I chose as a very brief textbook, The Earth and Its People, a Global History Brief Edition, because I want you to focus on the primary sources, and the primary sources are the historical truth. Remember that the closest we can get to the truth is the primary sources. So we have 2 books of primary sources, The Global Experience, Readings in World History, and The Human Record, Sources of Global History. And the reason I chose 2 is because both of them are deficient in one way or another. We need both of them to get to read everything about all the cultures. Interestingly, The Global Experience, the old edition, this is the 5th edition we have, but the 4th edition had nothing at all on Europe, nothing European at all. It was very biased, extremely biased. That's why I was using the Human Record to get some European things. The new one has a lot of European reading, so that's good. Okay, we have a website for this class, and it's Vista. It's a WebCT, and the website address you can get. How many of you are familiar with WebCT? A lot of you have used it. Okay, I put the notes to all the lectures are on WebCT, so you can download the notes before I give the lecture or after, whatever pleases you. And here's your user ID and your password. If you can't get on the website, don't call me, okay? Call the UH helpline. I can't get you on the website. Only the people on the helpline can get you on the website. So if you're registered for the class, you're automatically loaded onto the website. And so call them if you can't get on, all right? Exams. Let's see. We're going to have, okay. Okay, we'll use maps. Here are maps. We'll have blank maps for the exam. I'll come back to that in a minute. We're going to look at early civilizations, the foundations, the growth of them, the success and failure, the kinds of elements of the civilizations that are emphasized. Some civilizations focus on the individual, and other civilizations look at the community. And some of them value the existence, the freedom of the individual. Others are more concerned about the social community values. Some are more religious, and others are more worldly. Some are isolated and self-sufficient, and others are trade and make networks. Some civilizations are inventive. Others tend to be more traditional and unchanging. They're rooted in traditionalism. So we'll look at each culture in its own terms, and here we'll use the primary sources to study what each culture is like. And then we'll look at the interactions between cultures. As cultures come in contact with each other and meet, they change. They automatically change each other. And we'll do this through maps and primary sources. Okay, there will be, as far as the assignments for the class, there'll be a midterm and a final. And there'll be a project which you will write. The project is supposed to be a research paper of 20 pages with footnotes at least 10 pages of which must be text, but you can also use illustrations, whether they're maps or primary sources or art or architecture in it. I want you to choose one culture and study that culture intensively. And I want you to write a project proposal that will be due at the time of the midterm. Okay, question? No, you don't have a question? Okay. And your project proposal should outline what you want to do and should have a tentative bibliography to prepare you to start reading the final project. The midterm and the final exam will be pretty much alike. There'll be 3 parts to them. Part 1 will be an essay. You'll have an essay question, and you'll have a choice of 3 questions to answer. I'll give you a list of study questions for you to study and prepare, and then I'll give you 10 study questions. I'll choose 3 for the exam, and you write on 1. So you'll write 1 essay. Part 2 of the exam will be a mystery source. Okay, you're reading all these primary sources, and so I'm going to choose a mystery source that you have never seen before, and I want you to be a detective and look at the clues in that mystery source and tell me what culture wrote it, and you might even be able to tell me who wrote it in that culture, and about what date it is and what part of the world it is, and so that's a kind of short essay after reading that mystery source. Part 3 of the exams will be a map identification test. And what we'll give you is a map that has numbers on it, and you are to write a short essay identifying the place and explaining what the significance it has in history. Okay, so both of the exams will be that way. I think that just about covers everything. We have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has a question. This is the map you'll get on your exam. Okay. And there'll be numbers on it, and you identify. Is there a question? Yeah.
How long should the project proposal be?
I can't hear you.
How long should the project proposal be?
We're going to put some guidelines on the website. I've never required a project proposal. This is something new I'm doing. So it's only going to be a couple of pages, actually, but I want you to be thinking about your project early, and I want you to start working on it halfway through the course and not do it all at the last minute. Okay? Yes, question?
Yeah, so there are a few cultures that you could maybe suggest that you'd particularly be interested in hearing about?
Any cultures that you might want to do? Let me give you a clue here. Every time I've taught this course, 50% of the class does Egypt. And so I know Egypt is really interesting, but I like to read different countries than Egypt. Egypt is very fascinating. But I have a list on the syllabus. There's a list of cultures that you might like to think about. And I want you to choose a culture that is not your own, okay? That if you're an American, obviously none of these cultures will be yours, so that's okay. But if you were born in Hungary, I don't want you to do Europe, okay? But pick a culture that's not your own, and there's a list of cultures that you could do. Nobody ever does Melanesia and Polynesia, which is a very interesting culture to study. Let's see. The Eastern Indo-Europeans, the Hittites, Persia, and India, that's a very interesting topic. You can choose Western Indo-Europeans, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe. You have lots of choices. And if none of these choices appeal to you, you can ask us, you can suggest your own topic. Well, we'd like to approve it, but you know, if you want to do something different, feel free to propose something different that just interests you. Yeah.
With something like medieval Europe, would it be possible to do just medieval France, or do you actually want all of Europe? Because that seems like a really big subject for 10 pages.
You could do medieval France, yeah. Yeah, but just that's what the proposal is for, to clear it with me, so that I can see that you're doing something. And then you have to tie it into the course in some way and compare it at the end to some of the different cultures and say, for example, why Europe is different from Asia and different from Africa and how it fits. Well, we're just about to end the first lecture. We're going to take a break of about 15 minutes, and then when we come back, we're going to look at the time before there was history. So see you in about 15 minutes.